Hello everybody, welcome to my second channel. If you're coming from my MMA documentary channel, which is obviously my first love and where I started on the content creation space, and this is sort of a departure from that. This is more off the cuff, me talking about the things I love, and more particularly the world of video games, because that's always been my first passion as much as I love MMA. And I guess I just wanted to find a space to talk about it candidly, right? Just the connection to these games that I've played and why I love them for whatever reason that might be. It could be insignificant or it could be a major turning point in my life, though most of the time it isn't, of course, that. But I guess I just, as I said, wanted a place to talk about these things. And, you know, this channel, I got a huge inspiration from Nakey Jakey on YouTube, so shout out to him. More so his second channel, because he did 2 videos basically in this exact style of just talking off cuff to the camera with a timer on for 45 minutes, which is what I'm doing, and a green screen in the back just for sort of flavor. And I guess I'm living vicariously through that, and I wanted to just tell you about my sort of personal experiences with games in a more intimate setting. And I made a laundry list of sort of games I wanted to talk about on different episodes, and I was trying to figure out which would be the first I wanted to talk about, and Dark Souls 3 was the one that just made sense to me for a lot of reasons. And it was definitely not the first game I've played, and it definitely won't be the last, but it's one of the most impactful ones on my life, and I guess the way I look at games and transferring those lessons, if you will, into, you know, the real world, if you want to say that too. And I'm sure a lot of people have had similar experiences, because Dark Souls 3 was the first in the series that I played. But I think when you talk about this franchise and all the different games that From Software have made, it's, you know, I think everyone's experience initially is universal, and that's how everyone gets hooked onto the games, right? Is you come across that first boss, whether it's Asylum Demon from Dark Souls 1, the Last Giant, I believe it's called, from Dark Souls 2, Judex Gundyr, of course, in 3. You taste that first bit of death, right? You taste that first defeat, and it's so visceral and so unforgiving that if you haven't played one of these games before, it's just jarring. It's a jarring experience to go through, and it immediately, at least for me, and I'm sure a lot of other people were like this, it's, you know, the people who fall in love with these games all say the same thing, right? You taste defeat and you makes you want the victory even more. You yearn for it, and you try and you try and you try and try and you overcome those odds that, you know, once seemed insurmountable, seemed impossible, until suddenly you're victorious and you've got an extra 10,000 souls or whatever. And that feeling is just indescribable. And I could be wrong here, but to me, at least in my experience, the Souls games are the first which really evoked those emotions and evoked those feelings. And it, you know, it's not a reward that's artificial in a sense. It's not an extra item. It's not a bit of extra gear. That is an auxiliary addition to the games. You know, of course, there is loot, there is better armor, better weapons, but the real reward, the real sense of satisfaction comes from overcoming these obstacles in the form of these bosses. And it's just a magical experience. And I think I played Dark Souls 3 in, I think, 2018, right? So 2017, 2018. So I was a little late to the party. And it's not the type of game I ever would have normally picked up. It's everything about it just seems unapproachable, right? If you look at Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2, the UI, it's kind of ugly, kind of hideous, no offense to them, but once you get into the game, familiarize with it, you tend to change your mind. But at least from an initial approach, everything just about it doesn't look appealing. But the core mechanics are so sound. I think it's the simplicity of the rolling, the blocking, the attacking. It's all so tight. And yes, some of the other games probably haven't aged as well as the newer ones. But obviously they built on the systems over time. But it's an addictive gameplay loop. And I think that's the one thing from any game, you could say, that keeps people coming back. It's what's so successful with looter shooters like Destiny or Warframe. I haven't really played that one, but you know, it's the gameplay loop, it's the core loop. You know, I wouldn't be still playing Destiny on and off over the last 10 years if I didn't enjoy the gameplay. And I think Dark Souls is the same. And that's just from a gameplay perspective. I think if you look thematically and the lore and the world building, the Dark Souls 3 in particular, it's like piecing together pieces of a puzzle, right? That's a bit of a tongue twister. You know, the lore, it's not presented to you. It's not stuffed in your face like a lot of games do with their quests, with their objectives, collectibles, story as well. You know, the Soul series has always taken a different approach to that, and that it's passive. It lets you figure it out by looking at the tooltips on items and other stuff, or just watching a Vati video on YouTube and catching up with everything, just as what I, and I'm sure most of you who played the games probably did as well. But that in itself is part of the experience. They're going on YouTube and finding all these little details and putting together the pieces, navigating through this world, particularly in 3, which is just dying and it's depressing. There's almost something, I don't want to spoil too much, but the different areas of the game, I think, as much as I love Dark Souls 3, and it's one of my favorite games ever, right? Probably in my top 5, just because of what it means to me. I don't think there's any shame in admitting the first third of the game kind of is rough. It's very samey, very, Miyazaki, the director of the game, and most of the other games in the series, including Elden Ring, he loves to put poison swamps in the series. Most of you will know that. Not a fun experience, particularly in Dark Souls 3, but at the same time, it rewards you at the end with, the boss of Farron Keep, Abyss Watchers, which is, the first real test in the game, in my opinion. Once you get to grips with the mechanics, I feel like you start to go at a pace. But when you hit Abyss Watchers, I think that was a wall for most people, right? And more adversity is your reward, right? It's a harder boss. I think, the second half of the game in particular just improves and it builds, particularly when you see Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, which is obviously a callback to Dark Souls 1 with Anor Londo, and for the older fans of the series, I'm sure that was an incredible moment, not something I could experience personally, but it was, it was a special experience all the same. I mean, the art design, this beautiful icy landscape, a sort of dying city, and of course some great bosses in there too. And the game only just gets better and better and better and better. And obviously, I'm well into spoiler territory here, and I'll put a marker in post to ensure that you aren't spoiled, and if you don't want to watch the video. But the latter half of the game is so strong, and of course that culminates in a final boss, which is a love letter and a callback to everything the series has been built on. And the final boss, Soul of Cinder, is this sort of amalgamation of player builds that people have come up with over the years, and of course the final boss of Dark Souls 1, Gwyn, the Lord of Cinder, which is infamous because obviously it's music, the sort of piano that comes in, it's this sorrowful piece, and it's obviously recognizable if you've played the games, and even if you haven't, you probably have heard it, and it just comes together in this sort of final coup de grace, which I loved. And of course then there's the DLCs as well, which were a mixed bag, but I think the end result, particularly in the Ring City, was a special conclusion. One of my favorites in the series, Slave Knight Gale, is just, a jewel for the ages. It's at the end of the world. The whole world has collapsed at this point. I'm sure, those of you who played, I'm rehashing what you already know, but I just want to talk about my experience with it. It's a perfect way to conclude the series. And, one thing that Dark Souls 3 did so well that I absolutely loved about it was it just had that perfect blend of semi-linearity, right? It gave you a bit of freedom, but not enough where you felt overwhelmed, not too much. And also, on the other end of the spectrum, it didn't just railroad you completely like a lot of games do. I played a few story-based linear games, a horror one called Still Wakes the Deep recently, and it was fun and it was a good cinematic experience, but it was very linear and I found it quite jarring. Dark Souls 3 strikes that blend perfectly, and that's kind of why I prefer it to the other games in this series, in comparison, particularly to something like Elden Ring. And I know a lot of people would say their first Souls game is their favorite, and I pretty much agree with that. But after playing Elden Ring twice over, and I love that game, I think it's a masterpiece, I don't hold it in the same high standards that everyone else does, particularly because for me, open worlds aren't what I look for in a game. As much as they do it very well, they don't hold your hand, and they give you the freedom to explore without shoving stuff in your face. It was, I guess it was like a sea that was a puddle deep, right? An ocean is whatever. It was wide, but very, very shallow, I guess, overall. A lot of reused assets. But, the highs of Elden Ring were absolutely perfect. But I guess that's, as I just said, going back, is why I prefer Dark Souls 3 so much, is just, it strikes that balance perfectly, and it never feels like it's slowing down. It never feels like you're wasting time. Everything feels purposeful in that game. Each area feels earned, completing through, it's like a gauntlet, right? Each area you reach feels like a new gauntlet, a new challenge, culminating in the boss at the end of it, whether that's Aldrich at the end of the Boreal Valley, Yhorm at the end of the Profaned Capital, or of course my favorite boss in the series, the Twin Princes in Lothric Castle, at the top of Lothric Castle, the final Lord of Cinder, which is just a special fight. And of course that reminds me of the music as well, right? It's incredible. You have this beautiful orchestral blend, and forgive me for not knowing the composers behind it, but it adds so much. And I think if you play the game without music, I did this out of curiosity once, just to see what it would be like, particularly the bosses, and it just falls flat on its face, and it shows you how much the audio adds. And this goes for any game in particular. It's special. It's special, and all these brilliantly composed scores for each bosses, it only adds to the experience. And yeah, I absolutely another reason, right, where I absolutely love it. There is a lot of contention around Dark Souls 3 in particular with the difficulty of it, because a lot of Souls veterans will probably say it's a little bit too easy. I personally disagree, but of course, again, it was the first in the series that I played, so obviously my experience is going to be unique. And if you look in comparisons to the other one, obviously Dark Souls 1 was the pioneer, right? And I think 3 is the closest thing to, it's more like a Dark Souls 1.5. 2 is a sort of separate entity, and it's the awkward middle child that nobody really likes. Another thing I wanted to talk about was the summoning system. This is really been a big topic of debate, particularly in the Elden Ring fan base, and just general social media sphere, because obviously I played the new Elden Ring expansion recently as the time of recording. Shadow of the Erdtree came out, and I loved it because it really brought the difficulty back to the series that I feel like was missing a little bit. And difficulty is what I was just getting at earlier, because Elden Ring seems to be very built around summons. That's another reason why I don't like it as much, because it feels like the bosses were all designed around using summons and cooperative teamwork, which is part of the game and you should be able to use. But I feel like the problem with Elden Ring in that regard is it lent so far into that it made some of the solo play a little obtuse mechanically with the bosses. And I don't think Dark Souls 3 has that problem. Summoning is an option, and it's there, and it is there to make the fights easier. And it's meant to build that idea of teamwork and collaboration in a world that's desolate and isolating. You know, you pairing up with other players is meant to be a glimmer of hope. And I love that concept. For me personally, on the gameplay side of things, I prefer doing the bosses solo, and I always have. And there's a theory that I studied in my dissertation for game design, and it involves the state of flow. This isn't just with respect to games, it's with respect to everything. There's a state of flow the mind can reach where difficulty and fairness, I think, or something like that, blend together. If a certain task meets those criteria, your brain maintains a state of flow. It's almost like a state of unconsciousness where you're so ingrained in the game in this example that you don't realize what's going on in the outside world. You're so zoned in. I'm sure you can relate to this with competitive shooters. Do this very well. Of course, stuff like Counter-Strike, Call of Duty or whatever. It's the same thing. And I think playing Dark Souls 3 or any of the games solo, and particularly those really difficult boss experiences, I just think doing it solo puts you in that state of hope perfectly. And mechanically, it's so well designed that everything just clicks. I can't really describe it. If you haven't played the games, you can't really relate this, but you'll know exactly what I mean if you're an experienced player with, regards to the Souls series. It's this magical sort of flow state you reach where you're just so locked in, zoned in. And it's almost feels like a rhythmic dance. I think Sekiro does that very well in particular. But as you're dodging these attacks, you've memorized all the patterns of a certain boss you've been struggling on for a long time. When you finally beat it, it's this constant 2-3 minute flow state battle, a dance back and forth of you getting your hits in, dodging, and that final payoff of getting that final hit in is just unbelievable. And it makes for just such a magical experience that I don't think a lot of other games can really compare to, I just got to check my timer to make sure we're all good, because I've been waffling. And, I spoke earlier about the lore, the world building, and how you can piece the story of the universe with this world that Miyazaki and his team have built through item descriptions and various little sort of tool tips and notes and stuff. And I think I loved how they rewarded you for that in Dark Souls in particular, because, for those of you who played it, one of the last it's an optional area of the game, very near the end game, is Archdragon Peak, and it's not accessible by any conventional means. And I'm sure most of you, me included, would have found it through YouTube because they'd heard about the Nameless King, which of course is the boss at the end of it, as this big insurmountable force, a massive step up in difficulty for the game. And everyone was wondering how you get there, and of course people posted guides. But the initial way for when Dark Souls 3 launched was you had to use a specific emote at a specific point in the map and sit there for just about 10-15 seconds, and then a cutscene would play, and you'd suddenly be at a different place. You'd be at this mountainous sort of ruin completely out of nowhere. And I love that the game rewarded you for that, and it does that, you know, on a micro scale as well, with all these invisible walls and and like hidden passageways, and you know that leads to some other optional bosses and areas of the game, which no one would find without the, I guess, the motivation to explore, to find the new challenge or a new boss, a new thing that just becomes ingrained in every player. And I think that's just something they've established in all of the games, and they do it so well. And in case you're wondering why I'm looking this way, it's just because I've got some gameplay over the background just to sort of mentally stimulate me, giving me some ideas to talk about. But I guess to conclude is, you know, I speak to a lot of people, a lot of friends I have who play games, and they're very passionate about them, and it's a nice escape for them after a long day of work or whatever they've got going on. And I think that's a universal experience. Games have always been a chance to escape into something else, a new realm. And the problem with it is, this is just coming from my high horse position, is a lot of people aren't willing to push the boat out on what they want to experience, right? They stick to the very safe products. They stick to the same FIFA, sort of football, soccer games if you're American, or the UFC games, for example, or Call of Duty, and they aren't willing to push the boat out. And if there's anything, I think, if you haven't played these games, that you can take away from this video, is just give it a crack. If you have the option to do it, if you have the financial means to do it, I think just give it a go and push the boat out a little bit, because I envy those people who haven't gone through these experiences, because I would, more than anything, love to go through them all over again and then just wipe my memory and do it again and again and again. But I can't do that. And it's a first time experience I think everyone should try. And yeah, as I said, if there's anything you can take away from this video, it's that. Give this game a try. Give Dark Souls 3 a try, because I think it's the most forgiving mechanically. Or I'd say Elden Ring. Those two in particular will just unlock a whole new realm of games for you. You know, you look at streamers like Kai Cenat, for example. He's a good example of that exactly kind of mentality of game player that's very stuck in their ways to the same big series titles every year. And he tried Elden Ring, and obviously it's become a huge success for him, and it's blown the game up even more than it already has. And you know, he goes on about how it's a 10 out of 10 masterpiece, and it should be, and it is. Just watching him fall in love with that game was reminding me of how I felt when I first started playing the series, and I'm sure most of you did too. So yeah, Dark Souls 3 is a very special experience, a special game of mine. It holds a special place in my heart as one of my favorites of all time. And yeah, this is a bit of a departure from my normal content, as you know, but if you like this sort of stuff, just don't hesitate to hit the like or the subscribe button. I don't really have a schedule on when I'm going to do these sort of things, but I really enjoyed this, so stay tuned for more of it. Anyway, thank you. I'll see you soon.